The evening sun was slowly sinking behind the tall buildings of the city, painting the sidewalks in a soft golden glow. People were rushing home from work, some with briefcases in hand, others talking on phones, while a few street vendors shouted the last calls for their goods. Among the crowd walked a woman named Sarah. She looked like any ordinary passerby, dressed casually in a shirt and jeans, with a bag slung over her shoulder. Nobody could tell by looking at her that she was not just another face in the crowd, but a federal agent carrying an important responsibility. Sarah had just finished a long day of office work. Unlike the thrilling picture most people imagine of FBI agents chasing criminals or running secret missions, much of her day had been paperwork and analysis. She had spent hours reviewing case files, checking evidence reports, and preparing for the next phase of an ongoing investigation. By the time she stepped out of the office, she wanted nothing more than a quiet walk and some fresh air. The city streets, though crowded, gave her a sense of freedom after sitting inside for so many hours. As she walked down the busy sidewalk, she blended in completely. To the people around her, she was simply a young woman heading home after work. But then something unusual happened that quickly turned an ordinary evening into something unforgettable. A local police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, stood near the corner of the street, watching the crowd. His name was Officer Miller, a man who had built a reputation for being strict and sometimes overly suspicious. He believed it was his duty to keep a close eye on anyone who, in his view, looked even slightly out of place. That evening, his eyes landed on Sarah. To him, she seemed different. Perhaps it was the confident way she carried herself, or maybe it was simply that she did not look hurried like most of the other people rushing by. Whatever the reason, suspicion formed in his mind. Without a second thought, he stepped forward and blocked her path. "Excuse me, miss," he said firmly. Sarah stopped, surprised by the sudden interruption. She looked up at the officer with calm eyes and replied politely, "Yes, officer. Is something wrong?" Miller studied her closely, as if trying to find a hidden truth in her face. "Where are you heading?" he asked in a tone that was more demanding than curious. Sarah blinked, slightly puzzled. "I'm just heading home," she answered simply. But Miller was not satisfied. Something in his mind insisted that she might be hiding something. He looked at the bag on her shoulder, then at her casual clothing, and the suspicion grew stronger. "Do you have any identification on you?" he pressed. Sarah tilted her head slightly, still calm but now cautious. Encounters like these were not new to her. She had been trained to stay composed in tense situations, though this one was unexpected. She reached into her bag, but then stopped. Her instincts told her not to reveal her badge right away. At that moment, she wanted to handle the situation as any ordinary person would. "Officer, is there a reason you've stopped me?" she asked gently, hoping to steer the conversation toward logic. But Miller's tone hardened. "I need to ask the questions here. Please cooperate." By now, a few pedestrians slowed down to watch. It wasn't unusual to see police officers talking to people on the street, but the officer's sharp voice made them curious. Sarah noticed the small crowd forming, but she kept her focus on the officer. She tried again. "I assure you, I've done nothing wrong. I'm just walking home after work." Instead of calming down, Miller grew more aggressive in his questioning. "You seem nervous. What are you carrying in that bag?" His eyes narrowed suspiciously. Sarah almost smiled at the irony. If only he knew what was actually in her bag: case files, an encrypted laptop, and of course, her FBI credentials. But revealing that now would change the entire situation too quickly. She decided to wait, to see just how far he would go before she needed to step in with the truth. The officer, however, misread her calmness as defiance. "Miss, I need you to step aside and answer my questions properly," he ordered, motioning toward a less crowded spot on the sidewalk. By now, the whispers in the crowd grew louder. People wondered what was going on. Some pulled out their phones, not wanting to miss recording what looked like the start of a confrontation. Sarah sighed inwardly. She disliked attention, especially when she was off duty. But there was no escaping it now. She stepped aside as requested, still maintaining her composure. Miller stood in front of her, hands on his belt, eyes sharp. "You don't look like you belong here," he said bluntly. The words stung a little, but Sarah didn't show it. "I'm just another citizen walking on the street, officer. Nothing more." But Miller shook his head. "No, something about you doesn't add up. People don't just walk around here like this unless they're up to something." Sarah felt a small wave of frustration rising. She had always respected the work of local police, but situations like these reminded her how authority, when misused, could cause unnecessary trouble. She chose her words carefully. "I respect your duty, officer, but I'd like to understand why you're questioning me. Have I broken any law?" The officer avoided giving a direct answer. He was trapped in his own assumptions, unwilling to back down in front of the growing crowd. Instead, he pressed harder, convinced that his authority gave him the right to push further. The tension between them was now visible to everyone. The crowd sensed it, whispering and exchanging looks. Some sided with the officer, assuming he must have a reason, while others looked at Sarah and saw only a calm, ordinary woman being unfairly treated. Sarah, though inwardly tired, did not waver. Her training had taught her patience, the ability to control emotions even under pressure. She knew that sooner or later, she might need to reveal who she really was. But for the moment, she held her ground, letting the situation unfold step by step. The evening that had begun so quietly was now turning into a stage, with Sarah and Officer Miller in the center. Neither the crowd nor the officer had any idea that the woman standing there, questioned so harshly, carried a badge that could change the entire balance of power in a single second. And though Sarah preferred silence over spectacle, destiny had already decided that this was not going to be an ordinary walk home. The sidewalk that had once been filled with the ordinary noise of the city was now alive with tension. Officer Miller stood firmly in front of Sarah, convinced that he had caught someone suspicious, while Sarah tried to keep her composure. The air felt heavier, as if even the passers-by could sense that something unusual was happening. The crowd around them slowly grew, people whispering and recording on their phones, eager to witness the drama unfolding in front of them. Sarah, still calm, hoped the officer would realize that he had made a mistake. She did not want to reveal her identity so soon. After all, she was not on duty, and she preferred to keep her badge away from the public eye. But Miller had no intention of backing down. His suspicion had grown into something more, an urge to prove his authority. "I'll need to search that bag," Miller said firmly, pointing at Sarah's shoulder bag. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice remained even. "Officer, I respect the law. But do you have a reason to search me? What crime do you believe I've committed?" Her calm questioning only made Miller feel more challenged. He was not used to being questioned in return. He looked around and noticed the gathering crowd. The last thing he wanted was to look weak in front of so many eyes. His pride pushed him forward. "You need to cooperate," he repeated, his voice louder now. "If you have nothing to hide, you should not be afraid." Sarah took a slow breath. She had heard those words many times before, usually from people who misunderstood what authority truly meant. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, some sympathetic, some judgmental. The street, once filled with people minding their own business, now had strangers silently taking sides. "Officer," she said carefully, "I am not refusing to cooperate. I am asking you to explain why you're stopping me in the first place." But Miller's patience was running thin. To him, Sarah's calmness looked like defiance. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, though the edge in it was unmistakable. "I don't need to explain myself to you. Do as I say." The crowd reacted. Some murmured disapprovingly, while others whispered in agreement with him. A young man in the crowd raised his voice, "She's just walking, man. Leave her alone." Miller shot the man a sharp glance, which silenced him quickly. But the small outburst only increased the tension. Sarah stood tall, her bag still firmly on her shoulder. She was not frightened, but she was growing more concerned about how far this officer was willing to go. She could already sense that the situation was spiraling beyond control, and all because of a misunderstanding fueled by stubbornness. Then it happened. In a moment that shocked everyone watching, Miller reached for her bag and tried to pull it away. Sarah held it tightly, not allowing him to take it. The struggle lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to send gasps through the crowd. "Officer!" Sarah's voice was sharp now, no longer soft. "You are crossing the line." But Miller, caught between pride and authority, stepped further. His hand tugged at her shoulder, pulling roughly at her shirt as he tried again to grab the bag. The sound of fabric straining filled the air, and the embarrassment of the situation hit Sarah like a wave. The crowd erupted with noise, shouts of protest, gasps of disbelief, and the constant clicking of phone cameras capturing every second. Sarah's face burned, not from fear, but from the sheer humiliation of being treated this way in public. She wanted to end the scene before it grew worse, but she still held back from showing her badge. Timing was everything, and she wanted to be absolutely sure before she revealed her true identity. A woman from the crowd shouted, "That's too much. She hasn't done anything." Others joined in, some calling out for the officer to stop, others urging Sarah to show proof that she was innocent. Miller, however, seemed deaf to the voices around him. His focus remained on Sarah, convinced that his actions were justified. He tightened his grip, still demanding control of the situation. Sarah finally stepped back, her voice firm but calm. "You're making a mistake," she warned. But Miller ignored the warning. To him, it sounded like just another attempt to resist. The more she stood her ground, the more he felt the need to assert his power. The tension reached its peak. Sarah, aware that the situation had gone far beyond what should have happened, felt her patience running out. The officer had humiliated her in front of strangers, pulling at her clothes, treating her as though she were a criminal. And still, he demanded obedience without reason. Her hand slowly moved toward her bag. She knew that the moment she revealed what was inside, everything would change. But she hesitated for just a moment longer. Her training told her to control the timing, to let the officer walk fully into his mistake before she ended it. The crowd buzzed louder now, some demanding that she be left alone, others recording eagerly as though watching a movie unfold. Miller's breathing had grown heavy, his face tense, his pride wrapped tightly around his actions. Sarah, though humiliated and frustrated, kept her voice steady. "I am asking you one last time," she said, her words clear enough for the whole crowd to hear, "to stop this now." But Miller was blind to the warning. His pride was louder than reason, and he pushed once more, trying to pull the bag away. At that exact moment, Sarah made her decision. The time for patience had passed. She was not just any woman on the street, and it was time for the truth to surface. As her hand reached into her bag, the crowd leaned forward, waiting to see what she would do. Even Miller, for all his stubbornness, paused for a split second, uncertain of what was coming next. The atmosphere was heavy, as though the entire city block was holding its breath. The moment of truth was seconds away, and no one there, not even the officer, had any idea how quickly the balance of power was about to shift. The ordinary evening walk had turned into a public confrontation, and Sarah knew that the next move she made would decide how this story would be remembered, not just by the crowd watching, but by the officer who had pushed his authority far beyond its rightful place. And though she disliked drama, there was no avoiding it now. The moment had come to reveal who she truly was. The crowd around Sarah and Officer Miller had grown larger by the minute. What had started as a simple stop on the sidewalk was now a public scene, and people's attention was fixed entirely on them. Phones were raised high, recording every second. Voices whispered, some outraged, others confused, but all curious to see what would happen next. Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, and though she had been trained to stay calm under pressure, she could not ignore the burning embarrassment that came with the officer's actions. She had tried to reason with him, had given him chances to step back, but he had gone too far. Her patience, stretched thin by his stubbornness, had finally run out. She slowly opened her bag. The crowd leaned forward, as if the air itself had paused to watch. Miller's hand twitched, unsure of what she was reaching for. His pride told him to stay firm, but somewhere deep inside, he felt a faint flicker of doubt. With a steady hand, Sarah pulled out a small, leather badge holder. It caught the light of the street lamps, and for a moment, the entire sidewalk seemed to freeze. She held it up high enough for both the officer and the crowd to see. The gold emblem shone clearly, and the letters stamped on it were impossible to miss: Federal Bureau of Investigation. Gasps rose from the crowd, followed by a ripple of murmurs. Some people whispered, "She's FBI." Others simply stood with wide eyes, stunned by the sudden revelation. The phones that had been recording shook slightly as their owners tried to capture every second of this unexpected turn. Miller's face drained of color. His confident expression faltered, replaced by shock. For a second, he looked as though the ground had slipped from beneath his feet. He had been so sure that Sarah was an ordinary woman, maybe even a suspicious one, but now the truth stared back at him, undeniable and unshakable. Sarah's eyes met his, calm yet firm. She didn't need to raise her voice, her presence spoke louder than any shout could. "I gave you several chances to stop," she said clearly, her words carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "You chose not to listen." The crowd reacted instantly. Some clapped, others cheered, and many simply shook their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing that the woman treated like a suspect was, in fact, someone with authority far beyond the man who had tried to control her. Miller opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His pride, his authority, his certainty, everything had been stripped away in a matter of seconds. The uniform he wore, which had given him so much confidence, suddenly felt heavy, almost suffocating. Sarah, however, did not look triumphant. She was not here to humiliate him, nor to seek applause from the crowd. Her goal was simple: to set the record straight and to remind him, and everyone watching, that authority must be handled with responsibility, not pride. "I respected your position," she continued, her voice steady, "but respect is a two-way street. You abused it in front of everyone here." The words hit harder than any argument could. Miller's eyes flickered nervously to the crowd, then back to Sarah. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed unsure of what to do. The crowd's energy shifted. Where there had once been tension and confusion, there was now a clear sense of judgment. People whispered about how wrong the officer had been, about how calm Sarah had stayed, and about the way she had revealed the truth at the perfect moment. Miller stepped back slightly, his hands no longer reaching for her bag. He looked smaller now, not in size but in presence. The authority he once commanded had crumbled, replaced by the quiet but undeniable strength of the woman standing before him. Sarah lowered her badge, slipping it back into her bag with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had just unfolded. "This didn't need to happen," she said softly, though her words carried weight. "You could have treated me like any other citizen. You chose not to." For a long moment, silence filled the air. Even the city traffic nearby seemed quieter, as though the world itself was listening. Then, slowly, the crowd began to applaud. It was not loud or mocking, but steady and approving. Strangers who had watched the confrontation unfold now expressed their support for Sarah, their respect for her calmness and dignity. Miller's face reddened as he turned slightly, realizing that every eye was on him now. He had not only failed in his assumptions but had also embarrassed himself in front of a public audience. His authority had been questioned, and the answer had been clear. Sarah, however, did not stay to bask in the moment. That was not her way. She gave one last look at the officer, her eyes holding a message he could not ignore, a reminder that power comes with responsibility, and that every choice has consequences. Turning back to the crowd, she gave a small nod, acknowledging their presence without seeking their praise. Then she adjusted her bag on her shoulder and prepared to walk away. But before she could take her first step, Miller spoke. His voice was shaky, lacking the confidence it once held. I didn't know. Sarah paused, glancing at him one last time. That's the problem, she replied softly. You didn't know, but you acted as if you did. Her words lingered in the air, heavier than any punishment could have been. They were not spoken with anger, but with truth. And sometimes, truth was the sharpest blade of all. As Sarah finally walked down the sidewalk, the crowd slowly parted, making way for her. Some clapped her on the shoulder, some simply watched in silence, but all carried the memory of what they had just witnessed. The woman who had been treated like a suspect had revealed herself to be far more than anyone expected. And though Sarah blended back into the city streets as if nothing had happened, the lesson she left behind remained with everyone who had been there that evening. For Officer Miller, the moment would not fade easily. The look in her eyes, the badge shining in the streetlight, and the judgment of the crowd would stay with him long after the crowd dispersed. And for Sarah, though she preferred quiet over spectacle, she knew that sometimes the truth had to be shown in the most public way possible. Not to humiliate, not to boast, but to remind others of a simple fact: respect is earned not by power alone, but by the way that power is used. That night, as the city lights flickered on and the crowd scattered back to their lives, the sidewalk held the memory of the confrontation. A memory of pride, patience, and the moment when the truth shattered false authority like glass. And though Sarah disappeared into the crowd once more, her presence lingered, a silent reminder that real strength does not always come with a loud voice or a heavy hand. Sometimes, it comes with calmness, patience, and the courage to reveal the truth when the moment demands it. The sound of applause still echoed faintly as Sarah walked forward. She had shown her badge only for a brief moment, yet the effect of that single action had been enormous. The officer who had once stood tall and confident now looked smaller, his shoulders heavy, his face flushed with shame. The crowd that had gathered no longer saw him as the figure of authority, their eyes followed Sarah with respect and quiet admiration. Officer Miller remained frozen, as if his boots were nailed to the pavement. His mind replayed the moment over and over: the badge, the golden letters, the calm power in Sarah's voice. He had been so certain, so determined to prove himself right, but in a matter of seconds the ground had shifted under him. The very person he had treated with suspicion was someone who represented the highest standards of law enforcement. And worse, he had embarrassed himself in front of dozens of witnesses. The crowd began to murmur again. Some shook their heads, others whispered about what would happen next. A young woman holding her phone whispered to her friend, "He's finished. Did you see her face? She didn't even need to shout." Another man added, "This is going online. Everyone's going to know what happened here tonight." The weight of their words sank into Miller. He realized that this moment would not stay hidden. The phones capturing every detail had already turned the incident into more than just a street confrontation. It would spread perhaps to his department, perhaps to the public, and there would be no undoing it. Sarah, meanwhile, stopped walking. She turned back, her eyes steady on Miller. She did not want to destroy him, but she also could not ignore what he had done. People like him, if left unchecked, could misuse their authority again and again. And if no one stood against it, others would suffer the same humiliation she had just endured. "Call your supervisor," Sarah said firmly. Her words were not shouted, but the authority in them was undeniable. It wasn't just a request, it was a command. The crowd grew silent again, waiting to see if Miller would obey. For a moment, Miller hesitated. His pride wanted to resist, but his reason told him there was no choice. Finally, with a stiff motion, he reached for his radio and called it in. His voice was low, unsteady, nothing like the firm, commanding tone he had used earlier. "This is Officer Miller, requesting supervisor at my location," he said, his words clipped. The response came quickly, "Acknowledged. Supervisor en route." The crowd reacted with murmurs again, realizing this had grown into something serious. A few people drifted away, but most stayed, curious to see what would unfold. Minutes passed, though to Miller they felt like hours. He stood awkwardly, no longer looking at Sarah, his eyes fixed on the ground. The authority he had once carried seemed to vanish into the night. Sarah, on the other hand, stood calmly, her posture composed, her presence commanding without effort. When the supervisor arrived, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, the crowd parted slightly to let him through. His uniform was neat, his step steady, and his expression unreadable. He glanced at Sarah, then at Miller, immediately sensing the gravity of the situation. "What's going on here?" the supervisor asked firmly. Sarah spoke before Miller could. "This officer stopped me without reason, harassed me in public, and escalated the situation beyond control. When I asked for justification, he ignored my questions. I revealed my credentials only after he mishandled me in front of witnesses." She spoke clearly, with no anger in her voice, just truth. The crowd nodded, supporting her words with quiet agreement. Some even raised their phones, offering to show recordings. The supervisor turned to Miller. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone serious. Miller swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to defend himself, but the weight of the truth pressed down too heavily. The crowd, the recordings, the FBI badge, it was undeniable. I misjudged the situation," he admitted softly, his eyes still lowered. The supervisor's jaw tightened. He turned back to Sarah. "May I see your credentials, ma'am?" Sarah opened her bag again, this time without hesitation. She held out her badge, and the supervisor examined it carefully. His eyes widened slightly, and then he nodded with respect. "Agent Sarah. I understand. Thank you for handling this with professionalism." Sarah gave a small nod in return. "I don't enjoy scenes like this, but it had gone too far. Authority is meant to protect, not intimidate." The supervisor glanced sharply at Miller, who stood stiffly, sweat gathering at his temples. "You've embarrassed this department tonight," he said firmly. "And you've embarrassed yourself. We'll discuss this further at the station." The words hit Miller like a heavy stone. His career, his reputation, everything he had built over the years felt as though it were crumbling before his eyes. The crowd, however, seemed satisfied. They had seen justice in action, not through anger or violence, but through truth and calm authority. Some applauded softly again, while others began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied, their respect for Sarah evident in the way they looked at her one last time before leaving. Sarah stood silently, watching as the crowd thinned. She did not smile, nor did she show any sign of triumph. For her, this was not a victory, it was a reminder of the fragile line between power and misuse of power. She hoped that Miller would learn from this, though she knew not everyone did. The supervisor turned to Sarah once more. "Would you like to file a formal complaint?" he asked. Sarah thought for a moment. Filing a complaint would mean paperwork, meetings, and dragging the incident further into official channels. But then she looked at the officer's face, red, ashamed, and broken, and she knew the moment itself had already delivered a lesson more powerful than any written report. "I will let the department handle him," she said finally. "The truth is already out here, in front of all these witnesses." "That's enough." The supervisor nodded respectfully. "Understood. We'll take it from here." Sarah gave one last look at Miller. Her eyes held no hatred, only a quiet disappointment. "Remember this," she said softly, so only he could hear. "Every person you meet deserves respect. When you forget that, you lose the very reason you wear that uniform." Miller swallowed hard, unable to meet her gaze. Her words struck deeper than any punishment could. With that, Sarah adjusted her bag and began walking away once more. This time, no one stopped her. The sidewalk was open, the night air cool against her skin, and though she blended back into the city like any other passerby, everyone who had seen her that evening knew she was far more than ordinary. The city lights glowed brighter as she disappeared into the distance. Behind her, the officer stood still, his world shaken, his pride shattered, his career hanging by a thread. The supervisor spoke to him in low, firm tones, but Miller barely heard. All he could see in his mind was the badge, the calm authority in Sarah's eyes, and the crushing realization of how badly he had failed. For Sarah, the incident was over, but the lesson remained. Authority, she knew, was not about force. It was about respect, patience, and fairness. She hoped that those who had witnessed the scene would carry that lesson forward. And as the crowd's whispers faded into the night, the city returned to its usual rhythm, cars honking, people talking, street lights glowing, but the memory of that confrontation stayed etched in the sidewalk, a silent reminder that power must always be guided by justice. The night slowly settled over the city, but for Officer Miller, it was far from an ordinary night. His uniform, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his shoulders. Every step he took alongside his supervisor back to the station seemed longer than the last. The buzz of the crowd, the sound of their murmurs, the sting of Sarah's words, all of it echoed in his mind. He could not escape it. The supervisor walked beside him in silence, his face stern and unreadable. Miller wanted to explain himself, to defend his actions, but he knew there was nothing he could say. The truth was clear, not just to Sarah, but to every single witness who had stood on that sidewalk. Even if he tried to twist the story, there were recordings, photographs, and testimonies that would tell exactly what had happened. At the same time, Sarah continued her walk away from the scene. Her steps were steady, but inside she carried a mix of emotions. She felt relief that the situation had ended without further chaos, but also sadness that it had happened in the first place. As an FBI agent, she had seen people misuse authority before, but she had not expected to be on the receiving end of it in such a public way. Still, she had handled it the only way she knew, through patience, calmness, and timing. She could have shown her badge earlier, but she had chosen to wait until the officer had revealed his true intentions. And when she did reveal it, she did not use it to boast or intimidate, she used it as a reminder that authority must always be checked by responsibility. The following morning, the city was already buzzing with the story. Videos of the incident had spread online overnight, shared by those who had recorded the confrontation. People across the city and even beyond were watching clips of the officer questioning Sarah, pulling at her bag, and then freezing when she revealed her badge. Comments flooded in, many criticizing the officer's actions, others praising Sarah's calmness and dignity. In the police department, the mood was heavy. Officers whispered in the hallways, speaking about the video that everyone had seen. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others admitted quietly that it was a wake-up call. They all knew Officer Miller's reputation: strict, proud, sometimes too harsh, but none had expected his actions to lead to something like this. Miller sat in a small office, waiting. His hands fidgeted on his lap, his mind replaying every detail. He remembered Sarah's steady eyes, the weight of her words, and the crushing silence of the crowd when they realized who she was. His pride had carried him into the confrontation, but his pride had also destroyed him in front of everyone. When the supervisor finally entered the room, his expression was stern. He sat across from Miller and placed a file on the table. "We have received multiple complaints from the public about last night," he began. "There is video evidence, witness statements, and, of course, the testimony of Agent Sarah. Do you understand the seriousness of this?" Miller nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, sir." The supervisor's voice grew firmer. "You embarrassed this department. You misused your authority. And you disrespected not just a citizen, but a federal agent. We cannot overlook this." Miller lowered his head. He wanted to argue, to say that he had only been doing his job, but deep down, he knew it was a lie. He had not been doing his job, he had been feeding his suspicion, driven by pride instead of reason. "You will be placed under review," the supervisor continued. "Until further notice, you are suspended. The department will investigate, and the final decision will be made after considering all evidence. Do you understand?" Miller's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." As the words sank in, Miller realized how much he had lost in one night. His position, his reputation, his pride, it had all collapsed because he had chosen not to listen, not to respect, not to pause before acting. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her quiet apartment, sipping a cup of tea as the morning sun streamed through the window. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues and friends who had seen the video. Some congratulated her for handling it so well, while others expressed outrage at how she had been treated. Sarah, however, did not seek congratulations or sympathy. She reflected silently, thinking about what the incident revealed. To her, the true lesson was not about proving her power or humiliating the officer, it was about showing the importance of patience, dignity, and fairness. She remembered the faces in the crowd, the way people had gasped when they saw her badge, the relief that had washed over them when the truth came out. She realized that the moment had not only taught the officer a lesson, but had also reminded the public that respect and justice must always stand above pride and authority. Later that week, Sarah was called into her office for a debrief. Her supervisor in the FBI had already heard about the incident, and though he commended her for staying calm and professional, he also asked if she was all right. Sarah assured him she was, though deep inside she knew the memory would stay with her for a long time. "You handled it better than most would have," her supervisor said. "You didn't lose your composure, even when you were pushed. That's the mark of true discipline." Sarah nodded, though her thoughts drifted back to Officer Miller. She wondered what he was feeling now, how he was dealing with the aftermath. She hoped he would reflect, that he would learn from his mistake, and that he would change. She didn't wish for his career to be destroyed, only for him to understand the responsibility that came with his uniform. In the weeks that followed, the story slowly faded from the news, replaced by other headlines and events. But for those who had witnessed it, and for those who had watched the videos online, the memory remained strong. It became an example shared in discussions about authority, respect, and the balance between power and humility. For Sarah, life moved forward. She returned to her cases, her investigations, and the quiet routines of her work. But whenever she walked through the city, blending into the crowd as just another passerby, she carried with her the memory of that evening, the moment when calmness overcame pride, and truth overcame misuse of authority. And for Officer Miller, the lesson was harder, heavier, but necessary. His suspension forced him to look inward, to face the reality of his actions. He knew he might never fully repair the damage done to his reputation, but he also knew he could not repeat the same mistakes. The look in Sarah's eyes, the weight of her words, and the judgment of the crowd would remain with him as a reminder for the rest of his life. In the end, the incident became more than just a confrontation on a sidewalk. It became a story of patience and pride, of error and correction, of how a single moment can expose the true nature of authority. It reminded everyone that power is not in how loud you speak or how strong you appear, it lies in how respectfully you treat others, even when you believe you hold the upper hand. Sarah never sought attention, never wanted the spotlight. Yet, in that moment, she had become a silent teacher to everyone who watched. And though the city soon returned to its usual rhythm, the lesson remained a quiet echo in the streets, a reminder in the hearts of those who had seen it unfold. Respect, Sarah knew, was the greatest badge of all.